The sterile lights of West Point Correctional Facility hummed above the execution chamber, casting pale reflections on the silver instruments of death. On the gurney, Caleb Monroe lay still, his face calm, but his eyes haunted. Years of isolation had weathered his features into sharp lines of quiet resilience. His hands, once strong and calloused from years as a firefighter, now trembled faintly where they rested near the leather restraints. A prison doctor stood over him, preparing the lethal injection. The clear solution in the syringe shimmered under the lights like a quiet promise. The clock on the wall read 9:55 a.m. In 5 minutes, the chemicals would end his life. He was scheduled to die for the murder of Jason Hawthorne, a corporate heir found dead in his office with no witnesses. Except, according to Caleb, the truth he'd never been able to prove. The warden cleared his throat and stepped forward. "Any final words, Mr. Monroe?" Caleb closed his eyes. He did not speak for several long seconds. Then, in a voice rough with disuse, he whispered, "I just wish Shadow knew I didn't do it." A long silence followed. The syringe in the doctor's hand moved slightly, preparing for the final procedure. The witnesses behind the glass leaned forward. Some were family members of Jason Hawthorne. Some were from the press. All were waiting for the needle. Then, like a thunderclap in a stormless room, the prison phone rang. The warden's hand shot up. "Stop," he ordered. The doctor froze mid-motion. The intercom crackled. A breathless voice from the state director's office came through. "Emergency stay. The governor's office has issued a full halt. New evidence has surfaced." The words hung in the air like smoke. Time had not just slowed, it had stopped. The syringe never touched Caleb's arm, but it was close. Minutes, seconds even. Back in his cell, Caleb sat motionless. The weight of what had just been avoided bore down on him. Not with relief, but with disbelief. He had made peace with death. Now, that peace had been shattered. 5 years ago, Caleb had been a man with a simple life, a former firefighter, a quiet hero, a man who had risked everything during the wildfire seasons of Montana. He had pulled children out of collapsing cabins, run into burning forests with nothing but a wet bandana, and once saved an elderly couple from a flaming RV moments before it exploded. But nothing he'd done ever made him prouder than the day he rescued a Belgian Malinois from a kennel on fire behind a trailer home outside Helena. The dog had been trapped in a metal crate, its fur singed, eyes terrified. Caleb broke the lock with a crowbar, wrapped the shaking dog in his coat, and carried him 2 miles down a smoke-cloaked hillside. He named him Shadow. They became inseparable. Everywhere Caleb went, Shadow followed. The dog never barked without reason, never disobeyed. He had an uncanny intelligence, a silent loyalty. When Caleb couldn't sleep because the things he'd seen kept clawing at his memory, Shadow would curl up next to him on the floor and breathe, steady and patient, until his nightmares eased. And when he met Emily Ross, warm, clever, and kind, Shadow had immediately approved. She was a veterinary nurse, newly out of school, and the only person who could make Caleb laugh without trying. They built a modest life in the outskirts of Portland, Oregon. Nothing fancy, but peaceful, until the day the police came. Jason Hawthorne had been found dead, stabbed in his office at Hawthorne Global. Surveillance showed Caleb near the building. Fingerprints were found on a letter opener. Financial records showed an anonymous transfer of $300,000 to a hidden account in Caleb's name. And that was all it took. No one believed his innocence, except for Emily and Shadow. Emily had stayed as long as she could, visiting during the early trials, until her own world began to collapse. Her mother passed away. She was diagnosed with stage 4 lymphoma. She never told Caleb. She didn't want to add weight to the man already carrying too much. Shadow remained with her. Emily had refused to give him to a shelter, despite the medical bills, despite the fatigue. She fed him even when she could barely eat, because she believed in her marrow that Caleb had not committed murder. Shadow, too, seemed to carry that truth. The dog would sit by the front door every afternoon at 4 o'clock, as if waiting for Caleb to come home from work like before. Every time the news came on and Caleb's face was shown on screen, Shadow would growl, low and guttural, and then turn away, refusing to look. He knew, and yet The night before the scheduled execution, Emily awoke to an eerie silence. The apartment was dark, cold. She reached for her phone. It was nearly 4 a.m. "Shadow," she called. No answer. The leash was gone. The door was still locked from the inside. But when she stepped into the backyard, she found the gate ajar. The latch was bent. The leash had been chewed or torn. Something was wrong. She called the only person she hadn't spoken to in 3 years, Frank Delaney, retired detective, the man who had built the case against Caleb, but who had never felt quite right about it. "I think Shadow's been taken," she said. There was no emotion in her voice, just urgency. She didn't mention that her doctor had given her 6 weeks to live. She didn't say that she had stopped chemotherapy 3 months ago. She didn't say that she hadn't slept a full night since Caleb's trial. All she said was, "If we don't find her before morning, Caleb will die." And something deep in Frank Delaney's gut shifted. He didn't know why yet, but he picked up his coat and headed into the night. Because if the dog was missing, then maybe the truth was too. And if the truth had a name, maybe it was still running, on 4 legs, somewhere in the dark. The first rays of morning pierced the fog rolling off the Columbia River, staining the Portland skyline in hues of pale gold and silver. The world stirred awake, but inside Emily Ross's small apartment, time had already unraveled. Shadow was gone. The moment she stepped into the backyard, barefoot and shivering in her hospital gown, Emily knew something was wrong. The wooden gate creaked softly in the wind, swaying half open. A torn scrap of Shadow's leash lay curled in the grass like a snake that had shed its skin. The silence around her felt unnatural, too still, too deliberate. He had never left without her. Never. Emily's fingers trembled as she dialed a number, a contact she hadn't called in over 3 years. "Detective Frank Delaney," a tired voice answered after 2 rings, gravelly with age and something else, regret maybe. "It's Emily Ross." There was a pause, a beat too long. "Emily," Frank exhaled, as if her voice carried ghosts. "It's been a while. I need your help," she said, her voice cracking. "It's about Caleb and Shadow. The dog is missing. And I think it was an accident." Frank sat up straighter in his small home office, a mug of coffee cooling beside a morning paper. The headlines were all the same. "Execution today. Justice for the Hawthorns. Murderer's last day." "What exactly happened?" he asked, already reaching for his jacket. Emily explained in fragments how she'd gone to sleep after their usual evening walk near the Riverside Trail, how Shadow had been restless, sniffing the fence, watching the street. She remembered seeing a man on a bench that evening, a tall man in a dark jacket, wearing a baseball cap despite the warmth. She had dismissed it as paranoia, one of the many side effects of late-stage chemotherapy. But now, doubt clawed at her. She paced the apartment as she spoke, her legs thin beneath her sweats, her breath shallow. Every room was empty. No collar, no sound of pause. Only the faint warmth left in Shadow's blanket near the front door. Frank listened carefully. His instincts, dulled slightly by retirement but still sharp enough to cut through noise, were screaming. "Stay put," he told her. "I'm 15 minutes out." By the time he arrived, Emily was already outside, her pale face nearly translucent in the morning light, a knit cap covering her bald head. Her eyes, however, were wide and alert. "Shadow wouldn't run," she said as soon as he stepped out of the car. "He never leaves without me, not once in 10 years." "I believe you," Frank replied, scanning the yard, noting the broken latch, the scratch marks on the wooden post. Someone wanted him. But why? He's just a dog. "No," Frank cut in gently, "he's Caleb's dog." The implication hung in the air like breath in cold. Frank knelt by the fence, fingers tracing the splinters along the gate where it had been pried open. He found a piece of black fabric snagged on the metal latch, possibly from a glove. He stood, eyes narrowing. If someone took him, they either wanted to hurt Caleb emotionally, Frank said, or Shadow has something they're afraid of. Emily's face paled further. He never let strangers touch his collar. Frank turned toward her sharply. "Is there anything Anything at all he might have been carrying? Something you or Caleb gave him? No, Emily said, then paused. At least, I didn't, but Caleb might have. The minutes ticked by in heavy silence as they walked the perimeter of the neighborhood, asking the early joggers, the dog walkers, the homeless man outside the corner store. Nobody had seen a dog. Then, just as the light began to sharpen, a break. A maintenance worker in the park's landscaping crew recognized the dog from a picture Emily showed. Saw him this morning, the man said, adjusting his reflective vest. Big fella, right? Brown coat, real alert. Where? Frank asked. By the old train maintenance sheds, past the rose garden. He was with a guy, real quiet. Looked like they were trying not to be seen. Was the dog calm? Emily asked, breath catching. Not exactly. He was pulling at the leash. Didn't look happy. Frank didn't wait for more. They rushed across the park. Emily struggling to keep pace, her breath wheezing through her lungs. But she didn't stop. The sheds were run-down structures from forgotten era. Wooden doors hanging loose, windows cracked, graffiti along the walls. Frank motioned for Emily to stay back as he approached the farthest one. Before he reached it, a low bark echoed from inside. Familiar, distinct. Shadow, Emily whispered, moving past Frank despite his protest. They pushed open the door together. Inside, in a dusty office space filled with old filing cabinets and rusting shelves, Shadow sat alert, tied to a metal desk with a new leash. His ears perked up the moment he saw Emily. A low, throaty whimper escaped him, and he strained against the restraint. Emily fell to her knees. "Oh, baby," she whispered, reaching forward. Shadow bounded toward her the moment Frank cut the leash. He licked her face frantically, tail thumping so hard it echoed in the small space. But then Emily froze. Her hand, moving to adjust his collar, brushed against something foreign. A lump, cold, taped under the inside lining. "What the hell?" she muttered, slowly pulling it out. A small USB drive, wrapped in waterproof tape. Frank took it with gloved hands, examining it carefully. "Somebody put this here," he said. "Do you think?" Frank didn't finish the question. He was already thinking a dozen steps ahead. "We need to get this to the prison. Now!" They raced against the clock. Frank's old sedan screamed down I-5, sirens blaring from the dashboard unit he hadn't used in years. Emily held Shadow close in the back seat, whispering calm reassurances as the dog panted, sensing the urgency. At 8:47 a.m., Frank called the prison from the road. "This is Detective Frank Delaney, retired. I need to speak to Deputy Warden Carlos Reyes immediately." The line buzzed. Then a voice came through. "Steady, professional, Reyes here. We're en route with a USB drive. We believe it contains evidence relevant to Caleb Monroe's case. We also have Shadow the dog." Reyes's pause was short. "You have 10 minutes. When they arrived at the back gate, security was waiting. Shadow was led through first, surprisingly calm amidst the tension. Emily was allowed in after a brief scan. Frank stayed behind, watching as the gates closed. Inside, Warden Reyes met them personally, his eyes locked on the drive. "We'll process this immediately," he said, "but I can't guarantee anything until it's verified." Emily handed over the device. "Please," she said, her voice cracking. "He doesn't have time." Reyes looked at her, really looked. He saw the dark circles under her eyes, the telltale pallor of sickness, the determination behind her exhaustion. "I'll do what I can," he said quietly. As Emily sat in the visitor holding area with Shadow by her side, she leaned her head back and whispered to the dog, "You did it. You found a way, just like he said you would." Shadow nuzzled against her side and sighed, as if understanding the weight of what had just begun. Somewhere deep in the administrative wing of West Point, officials were unlocking a truth no one had dared to believe. And time, though still cruel, had been delayed just long enough. In the dim gray of his cell, Caleb Monroe sat with his back against the cold concrete wall, eyes closed, listening to the faint echo of a conversation somewhere far down the corridor. It could have been guards. It could have been someone else being led to visitation, or to their fate. But Caleb didn't open his eyes. The sound no longer registered as real, just one more passing shadow in a world that had long since stopped making sense. He had nearly died yesterday. He could still feel the tightening of the leather straps around his wrists and ankles, the chill of antiseptic swiped across his arm, the weight of breathlessness when he whispered Shadow's name as his final thought. Not Emily, not his parents, long gone, not the hundreds of lives he tried to save in fire and smoke. Just Shadow. Because when everything else had vanished, when society had branded him a killer, when even former colleagues turned away, when Emily stopped writing without explanation, it was a memory of that dog that had kept his feet on the ground and his sanity intact. And now, they were saying there was new evidence. Caleb didn't dare believe it. How many times had his public defender tried to offer him false hope? How many times had he stared at the ceiling, imagining a miracle that never came? His eyes drifted to the wall beside him, where the rough scratches he'd made over the past 5 years marked the slow decay of time. One tally per day. 1,826 lines in total. A few more had blurred when the roof leaked during a winter storm. Others he carved with a paper clip in the dark, whispering to himself just to hear his own voice. A voice no one believed. Outside his cell, the world had moved on. Inside, he had become something else. Part man, part memory. And yet, the image of Shadow had never faded. He could still recall the warmth of the dog's fur, the rhythmic thump of a tail against their old wooden floor, the heavy weight of Shadow's head resting on his chest on nights when the silence felt like 1,000 pounds. Shadow had been there when Emily left, when she stopped showing up at the glass window with her nervous smile and pale hands, leaving behind only rumors. Some inmates said she had moved away. Others said she got tired. But Caleb knew better. He knew her well enough to understand that something was wrong, something she didn't want him to carry along with his own sentence. He hadn't been angry, just more alone. Shadow, though, had stayed with her. That knowledge had become his one lifeline. He'd lie awake at night, conjuring images of Shadow asleep at Emily's feet, shadowing her as she watered plants, trailing her through their old walking path by the river. And sometimes in dreams so vivid they felt like visions, Shadow would come running, ears perked, tongue hanging, a tennis ball in his mouth, and drop it at Caleb's feet like an offering. A reminder that someone, somewhere, still remembered the version of him that wasn't in an orange jumpsuit. Caleb opened his eyes when he heard the metal tray slide to the bottom of his door. Breakfast. He didn't touch it, not because he wasn't hungry, but because hunger had stopped being a useful signal years ago. It had become background noise, like the flickering of the fluorescent bulb above him, or the hum of air vents that never seemed to breathe the same air twice. He stood slowly, stretching his limbs. The years had stripped muscle from his body, but the routine remained. 10 push-ups, 15 sit-ups, 20 slow, steady breaths. He whispered the numbers out loud, counting like a soldier, like a survivor. This was his rhythm now. And outside, in the administrative wing, his world was shifting, finally, in the cold confines of a government office across the city. Emily Ross stared at her reflection in a pane of glass. Her face was thinner than she remembered, her lips pale. The soft fuzz of regrowing hair peeked beneath the beanie she hadn't taken off since last year. Her eyes, however, still held something fierce. Shadow lay curled at her feet, his breathing slow and even, but his ears twitched. He was listening, always. The USB drive had been handed over. Officials had taken it seriously, but no one had explained anything to her since. She didn't care. What mattered was that it reached them, that the right eyes saw it before it was too late. Because yesterday, Caleb had nearly died. And if she hadn't found Shadow in time, if he hadn't been carrying that tiny piece of salvation under his collar, it would have been over. The thought made her chest tighten. She leaned down, brushing her fingers through Shadow's fur. He shifted closer, pressing his body against her leg, as if anchoring her to this moment. "You did it," she whispered, just like he said you would. She hadn't told anyone that Caleb had once trained Shadow to respond to certain commands. Simple things. Hide, wait, protect. But there had been one word they had practiced over and over again in their backyard. Deliver. A word Caleb had whispered to Shadow like a prayer, as if the dog understood it would matter someday. Emily had thought it was overkill, Caleb's firefighter instincts making him paranoid. But now she understood. Shadow had been carrying a message, a truth no one else could bear, and someone had tried to take it away, to erase it before it could be seen. Now it was out there, and all they could do was wait. Back inside the prison, Caleb was led to the chapel for his weekly session with Chaplain Wells. A small man with kind eyes and a gentle voice, Wells had never asked too many questions. He'd offered faith when Caleb had none, silence when Caleb needed it more. They sat across from each other, the Bible open but untouched. "You look different," the chaplain said quietly. Caleb offered a half-smile. "I was supposed to be dead yesterday." Wells nodded. "Yes, and yet you're not. I don't know if that means I'm lucky, or just in limbo. Maybe it means there's more to the story." Caleb looked away. "I don't let myself believe in stories anymore. Then believe in facts," Wells said. "They stopped the execution for a reason." "Yeah," Caleb murmured, "but they didn't say why. They never say why. They don't owe explanations to the dead." "You're not dead," the chaplain reminded him. And maybe, just maybe, someone finally listened. That night, Caleb lay in his bunk, staring at the ceiling. The tally marks on the wall glowed faintly in the moonlight. His hand drifted under his thin pillow, pulling out a folded scrap of paper, a letter he'd never sent. A letter written years ago, addressed to Emily. He read it silently, lips moving but making no sound. "I'm sorry. I wish I could tell you more. I wish you didn't have to carry this alone. If you're reading this, I hope you know that I never stopped believing in you, or in Shadow. You both saved me more times than you'll ever know." He folded it back, slipping it beneath the pillow like a secret, not yet ready to be released. And somewhere beyond the thick prison walls, Emily was watching Shadow breathe in his sleep, whispering the same thing. "We didn't give up. Not on him. Not on the truth. And not on the dog who carried it all." The silence in the prison's administrative wing was different now. Not the usual bureaucratic quiet filled with shuffling papers and humming over headlights. This silence had weight, like the pause before a storm breaks, or the moment between an inhale and the scream that follows. Deputy Warden Carlos Reyes stood motionless in front of the security monitor, watching the files extracted from a USB drive flicker to life on the screen. Around him, state officials, legal representatives, a digital forensic specialist, and Assistant District Attorney Rachel Green watched in tense silence. The screen was divided into folders: video evidence, audio files, financial records. One simple text file glowed at the top of the list. "Read _ first, TXT. Reyes nodded. "Open it." The forensic analyst clicked. "My name is Caleb Monroe. I am not a murderer. This evidence was collected by someone who believed in me, at great risk. If you're reading this, then maybe, finally, truth matters more than power." The password to the encrypted folder is the name of the only soul who's never doubted me. Shadow. No one spoke. Reyes gave a simple order. "Verify everything. We go frame by frame, second by second. If there's a lie in here, I want it uncovered. But if it's real, God help us. We've almost killed the wrong man." The analyst began with the video folder. The first clip loaded, time-stamped the night of the alleged murder. A top-down angle from a camera mounted in the corner of a glass-walled office. The desk, the leather chair, the Hawthorne Global logo on the back wall. Jason Hawthorne sat at his desk, typing, wearing a loose tie and a distracted frown. The door opened. Nathaniel Hawthorne walked in, a man in his 60s with the measured calm of someone who never entered a room without already owning it. He closed the door behind him and approached the desk. There was no audio, but the argument was clear. Jason stood, shoved papers across the table. Nathaniel leaned over, shouted something, pointed at the door. Jason refused. Nathaniel turned, opened his briefcase, and pulled out a thin, flat object, what looked like a blade. The forensic analyst froze the frame. Everyone leaned closer. It was a letter opener. Not a knife, not a weapon. The next moment, Nathaniel slammed it on the table. not into Jason's body, and gestured wildly. Jason sat back down. He was clearly shaken. Then, something unexpected. He started typing furiously on his laptop. Nathaniel looked over his shoulder, checked the hallway, then unplugged a hard drive from the laptop and tucked it into his pocket. The screen went dark. Green's voice cracked the silence. "There's no murder. Not in this video." Reyes nodded grimly. Next file. The second video showed a time-stamped feed from a private property. Jason again, visibly thinner, sitting in what looked like a converted basement office. A small camera sat propped in front of him. He leaned into it, as if he'd already rehearsed this moment. "If you're watching this," he said, "then my brother's plan either failed or succeeded too well." He took a breath. "My name is Jason Hawthorne. 5 years ago, I agreed to disappear." He detailed everything. How he'd uncovered a years-long embezzlement scheme orchestrated by Nathaniel. How he confronted him. How Nathaniel convinced him to fake his death in order to quietly fix the books before the public and the board found out. "I thought it was temporary. I thought we were going to come clean once we fixed it. But I was wrong." He staged a murder scene. He put Caleb Monroe in the wrong place at the wrong time. The weapon they found, it was mine. He took my blood from a medical procedure and staged the crime. I was hiding, and someone else almost died for it. His voice cracked. "I didn't know Caleb personally, but I knew of him. The guy who saved a child from a burning apartment in Northeast. The guy whose dog never left his side. Caleb's only crime was being loyal to the wrong company." The screen went black again. This time, the silence felt suffocating. Cross-check that video's metadata. Reyes ordered, "I want confirmation it's real." "It is," the analyst confirmed. "And there's more. Financial records matching the embezzlement timeline. Password-protected files tied to Nathaniel's shell companies. He laundered over $17 million through foreign bank accounts." "And Caleb?" Green asked. "His name was used, but the signatures were forged. The transfers were routed through a mirrored identity system. Caleb had no access, no awareness." Reyes exhaled, deep and long. "God." "I'm contacting the governor's office," Green said, pulling out her phone. "There will be an official emergency hearing within the hour. We need to move now." Meanwhile, in a hospital 2 miles away, Emily Ross's body was losing ground in a war her spirit refused to surrender. She lay pale and still in the ICU bed, the rhythm of machines dancing gently above her chest. Her body had collapsed after the prison visit. The doctors called it systemic exhaustion. Her cancer, her refusal to rest, the stress of 5 years' grief, and 1 day of emotional overload. But she was awake, barely, and she asked only one thing. "Is Caleb safe?" Jack Delaney, the retired detective, sat beside her, hand wrapped around hers. "He's safe," he said. "Shadow did it. You did it." Tears slipped from the corners of her eyes. "Then I can rest," she whispered. "No," Jack said, his voice cracking. "You don't get to rest yet. You get to live, to see him walk out of that place. That's the ending you deserve." She smiled weakly. Maybe. Back at West Point, Caleb still didn't know. After the brief visitation, he'd been returned to his cell. This time not on death row, but in a temporary administrative holding area. There were no shackles, no countdown, no more rehearsals for dying. He sat on the edge of his cot, staring at his hands, trying to understand what freedom might even feel like. After so long, the idea felt alien, like a foreign language he'd once spoken fluently but no longer remembered. Shadow had recognized him instantly. That meant something. That meant the man who'd walked into prison still existed, buried somewhere beneath years of steel and concrete and isolation. A knock broke the silence. The door opened. Warden Reyes stepped inside with a guarded expression. "Mr. Monroe," he said, his voice careful, "there's been significant development. You're being moved again." "To where?" Caleb asked. "To court," Reyes said. "The state is reviewing your conviction. Immediately. Based on the evidence that's come to light, your record is being re-examined. You'll be officially represented by a newly appointed counsel from the Attorney General's office." Caleb said nothing. Reyes hesitated, then added, "You were right, and I'm sorry it took us this long to see it." The van ride to the courthouse was surreal. No cuffs, no guards flanking him on both sides. Just an open seat and a moment of silence. As the city passed by outside, its buildings no taller than they had been, its trees no greener, Caleb watched people moving through their lives as if he hadn't been missing for 5 years. And maybe that was the hardest part. The world had moved on. He hadn't. Inside the courthouse, a crowd had already gathered. Reporters, protesters, former colleagues, and strangers who had read about the case in the morning news. Signs reading "Free Caleb" wave in the air beside signs that still bore Jason's face, now annotated with the word "Alive." Judge Amanda Leary presided over the emergency hearing. She reviewed the files in silence for 15 full minutes before speaking. "This court has reviewed the evidence submitted by the Department of Justice." She began. "Based on the overwhelming video, financial, and testimonial documentation, I am granting a full exoneration of Mr. Caleb Monroe. All charges related to the murder of Jason Hawthorne are hereby vacated. Furthermore, the court acknowledges a systemic failure that allowed this wrongful conviction to occur." She looked directly at Caleb. "Mr. Monroe, the state owes you a debt it can never repay." The gavel struck. It was over. Caleb sat in stunned silence, his hands clenched in his lap, not because he didn't believe it, but because believing hurt more. Because 5 years ago, when the cell door closed, he'd buried hope. And now, like a phantom, it had returned, not quietly, but with the roaring bark of a dog who had never stopped waiting. The press swarmed the courthouse steps as Caleb emerged. Shadow waited with Jack, tail wagging. The crowd fell silent when they saw him. Not the man they thought he'd be, but the man who never stopped fighting, even when no one believed he had a voice left. He knelt down beside Shadow, buried his face in the dog's neck, and whispered, "You brought me back." And in the fading light of day, a man wrongfully condemned stood free, while somewhere in a hospital room across town, the woman who never stopped believing in him exhaled and held on a little longer. It was early spring when Caleb Monroe stepped into West Point Park for the first time in 5 years. The air was brisk but not cold, the kind of temperature that reminded you life was beginning again. Pale pink blossoms were starting to bloom along the path, and morning joggers passed by with earbuds and coffee and a kind of casual certainty Caleb no longer possessed. He walked slowly, not because his legs were weak, but because the world felt too open. After years of confined spaces and structured movement, the freedom to choose where to go and how long to linger felt both intoxicating and terrifying. Beside him trotted Shadow. The Belgian Malinois was grayer now, his gait slightly slower, but his eyes were alert, his tongue lolling happily. Every few steps he looked up at Caleb, as if checking, confirming, yes, he was really there. No bars, no shackles, no countdown. "Still don't believe it either, huh?" Caleb murmured, running his hand down Shadow's back. The dog's tail thumped in reply. They paused at a bench overlooking the river, the same bench where, years ago, Caleb used to sit with Emily and sip coffee, while Shadow napped at their feet. It looked smaller now. Or maybe Caleb was simply different. He sat, exhaling deeply. "I miss this," he said aloud, not to anyone in particular, but the wind, the trees, the memories. Shadow lay down with a heavy sigh, head on Caleb's boot, the exact way he used to. The silence was comfortable. After a while, soft footsteps approached from behind. "You always loved the spot." Caleb turned. Emily stood there, wrapped in a soft wool scarf. Her hair grown back in a short auburn halo streaked with silver. Her face was still pale, but there was color in her cheeks, and her eyes, those same blue eyes, held the stubborn brightness of survival. He stood instantly. "You made it." "Barely," she smiled, and they hugged, gently, as if neither quite trusted that the other was solid. "I didn't know if you'd—" "I told you," she interrupted softly. "I'd be here when you walked out." They sat side by side. Shadow settled between them, resting his chin on Emily's knee like a child returning to a mother. For a moment, they said nothing. Then Caleb spoke. "I used to think if I ever got out, I'd run away, disappear. I didn't want to face the world that let it happen. And now, Emily asked. Now, he said, I want to build something that outlives the pain. She smiled. I thought you might say that. From her bag, she pulled out a folder, a draft proposal, a nonprofit foundation, the Shadow Initiative, dedicated to reinvestigating wrongful convictions, a place for people who didn't have a dog with a USB around their neck, a place for the forgotten. Caleb flipped through the pages in quiet awe. This is real? The state released your first compensation payment last week. She nodded. It's enough to get started. And people are paying attention. They want to help. They want to believe in something good again. He closed the folder. I don't know if I'm the right person. You're exactly the right person, she said firmly. Because you know what it feels like. Because you never stopped fighting. Even when you had no reason to. They fell into silence again. Not awkward, just reverent. Later that afternoon, they visited the small apartment Caleb had rented 2 blocks from the park. It wasn't much, 1 bedroom, old hardwood floors, a window that stuck when you tried to open it. But it was filled with light and, more importantly, freedom. There was a dog bed in the corner, though Shadow had no intention of using it. He's already claimed your couch, Emily laughed, watching the dog circle 3 times and flop down dramatically. I expected nothing less, Caleb grinned. A few weeks passed, then a few months. Spring warmed into summer. Emily's health stabilized under the experimental treatment now made affordable by Caleb's settlement. She moved in, gradually, naturally, 1 toothbrush and coffee mug at a time. By July, they no longer needed to discuss logistics. They were just home. Shadow aged, as all good dogs do, with dignity and a deepening wisdom in his eyes. He slept more, barked less, but still greeted the mailman like an old friend and insisted on his evening walks with Caleb, even if shorter than before. The foundation grew faster than anyone expected. Former prosecutors, public defenders, and investigators reached out. Donations came in. A group of law students from Oregon State volunteered to digitize archive files. Jack Delaney returned as head investigator. Quiet, thorough, and fiercely committed. Their first client was a woman named Linda Alvarez, wrongfully convicted of armed robbery in 1998, based on a single eyewitness who had since recanted. Within weeks, new DNA testing ordered through the Shadow Initiative revealed the truth. Linda walked free after 24 years. She cried into Caleb's shoulder the day she was released. You believe me, she whispered. You didn't even know me, and you believed me. I knew what it felt like, Caleb replied. That was enough. More followed. A teenager convicted of a carjacking he didn't commit. A man accused of assault based on mistaken identity. A single mother imprisoned on a coerced confession. Each story felt familiar. Each one healed a little part of him. By the end of the year, the foundation had assisted in 5 exonerations and had another dozen active cases under review. Reporters called. Podcasts invited him to speak. Legislators asked for policy recommendations. Caleb refused to become a symbol. He just kept working. But the name Shadow Initiative carried its own weight. At one press conference, when asked why he named the organization after his dog, Caleb answered simply, because he never gave up on me, even when everyone else did. He paused. And because he was the only one who could carry the truth when I couldn't. In the background, Shadow sat proudly beside Emily, tail flicking, eyes watchful. Time passed. Not quickly, not slowly, just steadily. On a quiet morning in December, Caleb woke before dawn. Shadow lay curled at the foot of the bed, breathing softly. Caleb reached down, rested a hand on his back. The dog didn't stir, but his warmth remained. They walked to the park, as they always did. Emily joined them after her tea. They took the long path by the river, where the sun rose gently through the branches, painting the water gold. At the overlooked bench, they sat once more. I've been thinking, Emily said. Caleb turned to her. Shadow's getting older. Maybe it's time to find him a friend. A younger dog, one he can train, pass things on to. Caleb smiled. You mean build a legacy? Exactly. They visited the local shelter a week later, and there she was, a nervous shepherd lab mix named Cleo, all ears and legs and too much energy. She barked once at Shadow, who stared her down, then wagged his tail. It was settled. Shadow spent his days showing Cleo the rules: when to sit, when to stay, when to bark, and when not to. Caleb watched it happen with quiet awe. "He's doing it," Emily said one evening. "He's passing it down." Caleb nodded, eyes moist, because he knows someday someone else might need her. And so the story continued, not as a tragedy, not even as a victory, but as a quiet, enduring truth that sometimes the people the world throws away are the ones who return to fix it, that a dog's love can hold more power than any court or jury, and that healing doesn't always come with fanfare, but in small, persistent acts of loyalty, justice, and grace. In the final chapter of the Shadow Initiative's first annual report, Caleb wrote, "This began with a lie. It nearly ended in death. But one dog, one loyal, quiet soul, carried the truth through every locked door. Shadow saved my life. Now, in his name, we save others." The report closed with a picture: Caleb, Emily, Shadow, and Cleo, for figures beneath the falling leaves of West Point Park, walking forward, together, toward whatever came next.